Welcome everyone to the Teapot in Victoria, Connections in Time. My name is Katie and I'm Public Programs Coordinator here at the Old Treasury Building. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the Old Treasury Building is on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. This talk is presented as part of the public program for our Belongings, Objects and Family Life exhibition, which is currently on display in the building. It's also presented as part of the Australian Heritage Festival. I'll hand you over now to Margaret for the Teapot in Victoria, Connections in Time. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Katie, very much. And thanks everybody for joining us this morning. Now, I should begin by saying that I'm a committed tea drinker. Don't get me wrong, I like coffee too, but tea was my first love and it's still my hot drink of choice to start the day. If there is nothing else, I will, reluctantly, make a cup of tea using a tea bag, but I infinitely prefer to brew my tea in a teapot. For most of Victoria's history, of course, that was the only way to make tea. So today I'd like to explore with you some of what we've learned about tea drinking in Victoria's history. I began researching the history of tea drinking as background to the current temporary exhibition here at the Old Treasury Building, which Katie just mentioned, Belongings, Objects and Family Life. This exhibition looks at the role a selected number of objects played in family life throughout the decades. We were especially interested in objects that might have shaped or influenced family life in some active way, rather than simply cataloguing the things that people owned. One of the objects we decided to feature in this exhibition was the teapot, since, we reasoned, tea and the teapot seemed to be a part of family life for most of the period of the exhibition, which was roughly 1840 to the present. But was this really the case? We set out to find out. Unfortunately, no one seems to have recorded when tea first reached our shores, but we've managed to narrow it down to the first few years after Europeans took up permanent residence. I could find no reference to tea in the diary kept by Edward Henty of his first weeks in Portland in 1834, nor is it mentioned in any accounts of the arrival of either John Batman or John Pascoe Fawkner in 1835. But we have clear evidence of its arrival in Port Phillip in October 1836, in the provisioning manifesto of the brig Stirlingshire, which followed the arrival of Police Magistrate William Lonsdale in September. Amongst the provisions for Lonsdale's detachment of soldiers and convicts, including essentials like biscuit, flour, preserved beef and pork, were 2 casks of tea and 2 of sugar. Soon shipments of tea were arriving regularly, duly reported in the daily newspapers. At first they came mostly via Sydney and Hobart, but by the 1840s they were arriving direct, shipped from China by British tea merchants. At this stage, all tea came from China, which held a global monopoly on tea production. By May 1839, the fledgling colonial administration was able to advertise locally for the provision of rations for its detachment of surveyors, soldiers and convicts. Tea was included in those rations, but not for everyone. While surveyors were allowed a half an ounce of tea and 2.5 ounces of sugar per day, male convicts received only a half ounce of brown sugar and no tea. The mounted police were given no tea either, but they were provided with 1/7 of an imperial quart of West Indian rum, which could be exchanged for the equivalent value of tea and sugar. How many did so is not recorded. But given the daily rum ration, it's perhaps not surprising that drunkenness was a common problem amongst the police. And in case you haven't worked it out, 1/7 of an imperial quart is about 162 mils, or a bit over 5 fluid ounces. That equates to about 5.5 standard drinks or shots in modern parlance, more than enough to have you well over the limit today. Within another year or so, enough tea was available for its use on public occasions, and we begin to see the first of what would become a popular form of public catering, the tea meeting, The first recorded tea meetings were held by members of the Wesleyan congregation and by advocates of temperance, including members of the Total Abstinence Society. One such was held in Scott's Church schoolroom on the evening of Monday, the 26th of December, 1842, when a plentiful supply of tea and edibles was served to about 100 people. Several new members apparently signed the pledge. And here is another tea meeting described in July 1845. By the early 1840s, tea was regularly included in servants' rations and in the rations for workers in the bush. The amounts undoubtedly varied from place to place, along with the quality, but the general allowance seems to have been between 7 to 10 pounds of flour, the same amount of meat, 1 pound of sugar, and 2 ounces of tea weekly. And these were liberal rations by English standards. One Englishman, commenting on A Squatter's Life in the Port Phillip Gazette in August 1845, described what he thought was the usual fare served in the bush: mutton or beef, damper, and so on. And he added, "At most stations in the bush, tea forms an accompaniment to every meal." Now, 40 years later, another Englishman, Richard Twopeny, would repeat this observation in his popular book, Town Life in Australia, published in 1883. Tea, Twopeny wrote, may fairly claim to be the national beverage. A large majority of the population drink it with every meal. And indeed, Australians of all classes were prodigious tea drinkers. From the 1840s until 1900, our consumption of tea was the highest in the world, averaging 4 to 5 kilograms per person per year. Thereafter, it remained the second highest, after Great Britain. It was not until the 1940s that coffee began to make real inroads into annual tea consumption. But in fact, tea is still very popular. Australians consumed over 10 kilograms per household in 2021. In the 19th century, bulk tea was shipped to Victoria in wooden boxes known as tea chests. These chests tended to be used once only and were then auctioned off. Many a household stored at least some of their belongings in tea chests. So one way or another, tea was very much a part of Australian family life. Here we see a tea chest used as a counter by a gold buyer on the goldfields in the 1850s. So why was tea so popular? By the early 19th century, tea was becoming increasingly popular in Britain and in the British diaspora. Australia was no exception. Part of tea's appeal was its durability and the fact that it was light and easily transported. A supply was readily carried from place to place by itinerant workers, and unlike coffee, the beans of which had to be first roasted and then ground, tea required very little equipment and almost no preparation. Itinerant workers, shepherds and herdsmen could easily carry a week's supply of tea with them, often stored in a billy, a tin can with wire handles, which could be placed directly on a fire to boil. The author mentioned earlier, writing about life as a squatter in 1845, described how the shepherds and hut keepers boil the tea and sugar together, and when a man is very much heated and thirsty, a pint pot of this, piping hot and without milk, is a very refreshing drink. Over time, of course, the billies became blackened by the fire on the outside and by accumulated tannin from the tea on the inside. But this was only believed to make the water boil faster and improve the flavour of the tea. Most rural families used billies routinely to take tea out to workers for lunch or afternoon breaks, or to carry small quantities of milk. City families also had billies for picnics, or until about the 1940s, to receive their daily milk supply from a visiting milkman. There are many photographs showing billies in use in regional Victoria, much like the one we show here of the girls of the Bomball family taking out the lunch to their father on the property. One of the jobs for children on farms was often to take out the lunch to the men and women working in the fields. It saved the workers a walk and no doubt saved the housewife from having to do it herself. Now, to judge from the quantity of lunch being carried here by the Bombal girls, it would have been pretty difficult for a woman with a young child to manage this alone anyway. In this wonderful photograph from Bimburi in the Mallee in 1921, the girl on the outside right carries a calico lunch bag, while the eldest girl in the middle carries a substantial billy, almost certainly full of hot, sweetened tea. The smallest girl carries the tin mug for the tea. Now, here is another photograph of a family taking afternoon tea from a large billy at harvest time in Werrimal South near Mildura in 1937. But of course, within a family setting, most people made tea from dried leaves left to steep or stew in boiling water in a teapot. Tea bags didn't make an appearance until the 1920s, and then they were almost all homemade bags sewn from muslin. Commercial tea bags first appeared in Australia in the 1960s. One scholar has estimated that at that time, tea bag tea accounted for only about 3% of all tea consumed. But that changed very quickly. He estimates that in Britain today, more than 90% of tea is made using the ubiquitous bags. But until the 1970s, and probably for much longer, most families owned a teapot, and many owned several, in varying sizes and made of differing materials. The largest teapots were often called tea kettles, and these were very large indeed. They were often used at public functions like the tea meetings we talked about before, and they required serious muscle power to lift and pour. Family teapots were usually smaller and made from many different materials. The cheapest and simplest were often made of metal. As early as 1838, one retailer, a Mr. Pitman, advised the public that he had available, quote, a large assortment of Britannia metal teapots for sale. But ceramic teapots were also popular. In July 1845, Thomas Cheetham announced the arrival of a consignment of crockeryware, including tea services complete, all of the newest patterns, and of the very best quality. Wealthy families usually owned several teapots to suit different occasions. Special occasions like formal afternoon teas or the tea served after a formal dinner called for a full tea service, like those advertised by Thomas Cheetham. This might be made of fine china, like this Chelsea service from the mid-18th century, or of silver. But the critical thing was that the components matched. It was a set. This generally included the teapot itself of a generous size, a separate hot water jug, possibly a milk jug, a sugar bowl, and tea strainer with accompanying saucer. If the set was a china one, they might well be matching teacups, saucers, and plates too, as shown here. But often these were of a different pattern. One historian, Annie Gray, argues that the use of matching teacups, saucers, and plates became more important socially as the 19th century wore on. By the 1880s, ownership of a tea set was a necessity in middle-class households. And these tea services were often treasured from one generation to another. I still have one used by my grandmother. Now here it is, though I don't dare use it anymore. The design is rather an unusual one, and I've always rather liked it. What I do use several times every day is her tea scoop, used to measure leaf tea from a tin. It's Australian made with a decorative motif of gum leaves, and it's very well worn now, but it reminds me of my childhood home every time I use it. By the early 19th century, a plethora of teaware was available, along with all sorts of other essentials like sugar tongs for serving the pieces broken from loaf sugar, shown here from the collection of the Powerhouse Museum. Later, tongs like this were used for lump sugar, which was always an expensive commodity. Teaware often featured amongst wedding gifts to wealthy brides, suggesting that they formed an essential part of the household equipment required by a society hostess. Such gifts were all carefully described in the newspaper accounts of these weddings, along with the name of the giver. When Blanche Watson married Bertram Armitage in February 1895, for example, the society couple received no less than 4 afternoon tea services, one described as a Dalton China afternoon tea service, and another as a Japanese afternoon tea service, possibly something like this one from the collection of Montdelancey. They were also given a silver kettle, a silver afternoon tea service, a silver cake basket, a silver jam jar, a set of silver afternoon teaspoons, a silver tea caddy, a silver coffee tray, and a, quote, handsome solid silver tray, along with other essentials like a crumb scoop and tray and a set of silver grape cutters. Mrs. Armitage had a very impressive array to choose from when she invited her friends to tea. At first, any silver tea services were made from sterling silver and were extremely expensive acquisitions. Those presented to worthy citizens may well have been sterling silver. One of the first such presentations was made to William Westgarth in 1847 on the eve of his departure from Victoria. He later returned, and the silver service is held in the collection of Museums Victoria. This is the teapot. But increasingly from the early 19th century, as plating techniques improved, most silver tea services were made from silver plate, and a wide range was available in Melbourne throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Silver teapots or silver tea services remained popular wedding gifts until well after the Second World War. This silver plate teapot was a wedding gift to Mr. and Mrs. J.A. Lord in 1901. It is very similar to one shown in this advertisement placed by the Melbourne jeweller and silversmith Dunklings of Burke Street in 1910. Their plated teapots then ranged in price from 10 and 6pence to 80 shillings. At a time when the minimum wage was mostly less than 42 shillings per week, prices like this meant that even silver plate teapots were destined for the villas of Melbourne rather than the cottages. Sterling silver was in another class entirely. For everyday use, there was a wide variety of serviceable metal teapots, some plain tin, others in Britannia metal, which was a silvery coloured metal blend, or in enamelled metal like this large pot used on the farm at Montdelancey in the early years of the 20th century. It was designed to sit on a primus or kerosene stove to keep the tea warm. And there was an equal variety available in ceramic teapots. Like their metal counterparts, ceramic teapots varied hugely in quality and therefore price. Most of the large English potteries made teapots along with tea sets, matching sets of cups, saucers and plates, and these were imported in large quantities into Victoria. At the top of the hierarchy were the large porcelain factory, manufacturers like Worcester, Spode, Dalton or Wedgwood, who produced English porcelain goods. But the Staffordshire potteries also exported a huge range of earthenware, more suited to the kitchens of ordinary Victorians. Imported ceramics also arrived regularly from China and Japan, although the main craze for chinoiserie, as it was known, was waning by the 1830s. But some styles had enduring popularity, notably the patterns in blue and white transfer ware, originating in China, but by the 19th century made by almost every Staffordshire potter. The best known was probably the so-called willow pattern, shown here on a large platter from the Flagstaff Hill Maritime Museum's collection. But blue and white ware was made in many patterns and was extremely popular. It's been found in archaeological sites dating from the 1840s in Melbourne, on the goldfields and in shipwreck material. The cup shown here was excavated from the inner city area known as Little Lon in the 1980s. It's unmarked and could have been deposited at any time from the 1840s to the 1880s. Everyday china teapots were usually made of sturdy materials, generally in a glazed earthenware or stoneware. Old brown teapots were popular for a long time, as seen in the advertisement from the Argus from 1916, shown here. These teapots were shipped in regular consignments to Victoria, as one story told in the Queenscliff Maritime Museum makes clear. The clipper ship Light of the Age made regular voyages between Liverpool and Melbourne from the mid-1850s. But the final voyage in 1868 ended in disaster when the ship grounded, leaving port in Queenscliff. According to passenger accounts, both the captain and several other crew members were drunk and failed to understand the pilot's signals. While the passengers were rescued, much of the cargo was lost, including a case of brown teapots. As the museum's label says, for many years, every Queenscliff household was the proud owner of a brown teapot from a case of the cargo strewn along the coast. Another popular wedding gift was the tea caddy. This was a container, often in a box shape, designed to hold tea. A silver tea caddy, you might remember, was amongst the gifts received by Blanche Armitage in 1895. But tea caddies were made from many different materials. Finely carved wooden caddies were popular in the early decades of the 19th century, and many fine examples survive in museum collections, like this one owned by Elizabeth Russell, who married in 1865. This tea caddy has 2 compartments, each lined with paper. Caddies were also made locally. The Age reported that several tea caddies made from local timber were exhibited at an exhibition in Sandhurst in 1866. The great advantage of such caddies was that they could be locked, as you can see. In the early decades, when tea was expensive, the best tea might well be stored in a locked tea caddy, with the key held by the mistress of the house. Tea caddies were also made from japanned metal, and in the 20th century resembled decorative tins. Indeed, ordinary folk often simply reused tins or jars to store their tea. Later in the century, tea companies also sold tins they called tea caddies, like this example produced by Bushels in the 1930s. Articles of furniture that resembled tables with tea caddies on top were also popular and were called teapoys. When Governor Madden's second daughter Sylvia married in 1898, one of her wedding presents was described as a, quote, Indian tea table. This might well have been a teapoy. Now, while both sexes drank tea, often in copious quantities, in the family setting and on public social occasions, tea rituals were almost always controlled by women. Tea drinking as an opportunity for socialising was well established in Britain before 1830 and was imported to Australia along with other social customs. It was usual for the hostess of any gathering to pour the tea, which was then handed to her guests by a servant, if she had one. In a family setting, convention assigned this role to the wife and mother, who, quote, presided over the tea table, poured the tea and distributed around the table as required. She also oversaw the manners of those present. Later, when tea rooms became popular additions to urban environments, women might negotiate the pouring role. It was polite to ask, shall I pour? Or more humorously, shall I be mother? At home, tea might serve any number of purposes, from an excuse to sit down to an opportunity to socialise children. Middle-class children learned their tea manners from other adults present long before they ventured into the wider world. And there are many photographs of families grouped around the tea table, often pictured outdoors, I suspect for the light. Here, the Stuart family of Warwick-Nabil take tea in their garden in the early 1900s. The photograph records that even quite small children have cups of tea. The teapot seems to be resting on something, perhaps a primer stove to keep the tea hot. In the 19th century, most people drank their tea black, but sweetened with sugar. It was probably for this reason that rations for servants and labourers often linked tea and sugar together. Although tea drinking alone didn't drive the national consumption of sugar, it undoubtedly contributed. And in the 1800s, Australians also led the world in sugar consumption. In 1890, we consumed just under 1 kilogram of sugar per person per week, or 45.5 kilograms per year. Now, no doubt the jam factories accounted for some of this, but it is still a huge amount of sugar. Our annual consumption of sugar peaked in 1951 at a whopping 57 kilograms per person. It's now about 43 kilograms. Tea was considered a mild stimulant and a, quote, refreshing drink in the Australian climate, but its energy component was undoubtedly boosted considerably by the generous addition of sugar. No wonder both housewives and farm labourers found that their well-earned cuppas gave them a boost of energy. After 1900, more people began to drink their tea with sugar and milk. The earlier preference for black tea, that is, tea without milk, may have reflected the fact that before refrigeration, it was hard to keep milk fresh. The quality of milk sold in cities also improved in the 20th century, with better hygiene and a crackdown on adulteration. In the meantime, a new milk product appeared that promised to keep fresh longer. This was condensed milk, a product made of sweetened milk from which much of the water had been removed. It was first marketed from the mid-19th century, but it increased in popularity after its use in the American Civil War. Condensed milk was sold in tins and was very useful in households without ice boxes or other capacity to keep fresh milk from spoiling. The historian Geoffrey Blainey reports that in the 1900s, some households actually preferred condensed milk to fresh milk because they believed it to be more hygienic. From 1911, some of this condensed milk was manufactured locally when Nestle opened a new factory near Warrnambool. The earlier habit of drinking tea without milk may also have followed the custom of tea drinking in China, which, as we saw, had a monopoly on global tea exports until later in the 19th century. At first, all tea imported into Victoria, perforce, came from China, mostly via British tea merchants. And at first, Victorians drank the full range of Chinese tea, including a lot of green tea. The local press took a keen interest in this trade and in Sino-British relations. In the 1830s, these were fraught, as Britain tried to force Imperial China to accept payment for tea in opium to address what they then had, a marked trade imbalance caused by their tea imports. Chinese resistance to this pernicious trade eventually led to armed conflict, the so-called Opium Wars of 1839 to 42, and then 1856 to 60. Britain's success in the Opium Wars allowed its merchants to dominate the tea trade thereafter. Victoria may have been an isolated little imperial outpost, but it was linked directly to global geopolitics through the tea trade, and it followed developments keenly. And not content with dominating trade, the mercantile British also sought a stake in the production of tea and eventually managed to smuggle enough plants out of China to establish their own plantations, initially in Assam, which was then British India, of course, then later in Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon, and elsewhere. By the late 19th century, these plantations were sufficiently developed to supply world markets. Gradually, Australians came to prefer Ceylon tea to China, ostensibly because the Chinese product was often adulterated and because Ceylon tea was said to produce a stronger brew. Now, whether there was any truth in the rumours of adulterated Chinese tea, it's very difficult to judge. But certainly, late 19th century Australian society was well primed to believe anti-Chinese stories and to accept the narrative of British plantation owners that their product was superior. Whatever the reasons, from the 1880s, Ceylon and Indian tea replaced Chinese tea in consumer preference. Tea merchants also began to package their tea in decorative tins and pre-weighed packages with attractive printed labels. Prominent lithographers like Troidel and Son were commissioned to design colourful labels, which helped rival products to attract consumer attention. Some companies, like the Ceylon and Foochow Tea Company, whose advertising poster is shown here, still sourced their tea from both the subcontinent and China. But gradually, Chinese tea varieties became a minority drink. Consumption patterns narrowed in response. Whereas earlier in the century, Victorians drank several varieties of tea, including black, green, even white, and oolong. By the late 19th century, the standard drink was black leaf tea, with or without, with sugar and with or without milk. Now, the iconography of this poster is rather interesting, suggesting that tea was increasingly promoted to market segments. In this case, the family mixture, the Queen blend, the People's Choice, and the Ceylon and Foochow mixture. What, if anything, differed between the mixtures is not clear, but certainly the image for the family mixture suggests that it was acceptable for children to join their parents in drinking tea. That children began drinking tea quite young is suggested in many photographs of the late 19th century. Children tucked into cups of tea with generous slabs of cake at picnics, as shown in this photograph of the Stevenson boys at Merrigham in 1910. And note that the boys have both china cups and lacy napkins to accompany the cake piled on their plates. Or they joined their families at afternoon tea in the garden, carefully balancing china cups on saucers and learning the elaborate etiquette that would accompany such events as adults. This photograph shows the Beckett family at tea, Thomas Beckett in his militia uniform, Kate Beckett, and their 3 children, George, Nellie, and Lawrence. Now, both George and Nellie have their own cups, though I have to say that neither look very enthusiastic about it. They'd probably been told to stay absolutely still for the photograph. The tea service is an elaborate one. The teapot, possibly Wedgwood's famous jasperware, it certainly looks like it, with fine china cups, saucers, and a tea tray. Children also played at taking tea, using miniature tea sets if they had them. Here, Molly and Arthur Farrell played with a miniature tea set in Heidelberg in 1907. And here's another photograph of a child, Dorothy Fidz, having a tea party with her 2 dolls in 1934. Miniature tea sets were made in the 19th century by all the major potteries and were exported to Australia. Their fragility meant that children were sometimes only allowed to play with them on special occasions. But the advent of plastics in the 20th century made children's tea sets much more widely available and much cheaper, of course. Some lovely children's tea sets can be found in Museum and Historical Society collections around Victoria, including this one from the Mont Delancey collection, which belonged to Ida Baker in about 1912. As tea drinking spread throughout the community, rules and rituals evolved to guide in its preparation. These varied widely, but one adage that has survived to the present is the direction to use 1 teaspoon of tea per person and an additional 1, quote, for the pot. Beyond that, preferences varied widely, and even this old rule was questioned from time to time. Over the years, debate has surrounded most aspects of tea making. Should the water be boiling or just off the boil? Must it be water freshly boiled? And most importantly, should the teapot be warmed before the tea is added? Most seem to agree on the necessity of warming the pot. Later, when tea with milk was more common, equal controversy surrounded the question of when the milk should be added. Should it be placed in the teacup first, warmed or otherwise, or added afterwards? There were passionate adherents of both, including none other than the literary giant George Orwell, who published his 11 Rules of Tea Making in 1946. for the record, Orwell added milk to his tea after pouring. But he also drank his tea without sugar, which he recognised placed him in a decided minority at the time. Victorian newspapers and women's magazines regularly published advice on how to make a proper cup of tea. And I've chosen this one to show you here. It comes from an article published in 1936 by Ruth First, who was described as cookery expert to the Australian Women's Weekly. And I was interested by her advice because it seemed rather elaborate. In the first place, she suggested that 2 teapots should be used instead of 1, both of which were to be warm and dry. She also insisted that the teapot should be brought to the kettle and not vice versa, thus ensuring that the water was boiling. Orwell also insisted on that point. Her suggested method of making the tea in the first pot, then pouring it into the second, may well have been a strategy for containing the tea leaves and also stopping the tea from stewing. Once transferred to the second pot, she said, it can then stand for any length of time without spoiling. Many other rituals evolved to deal with errant tea leaves, including rotating the teapot both clockwise and anti-clockwise before pouring. That's never worked for me, but perhaps I haven't developed the knack. Other writers suggested using little muslin bags, anticipating the later development of tea bags. How tea was served and consumed attracted its own set of rules, though like all such social conventions, they changed over time and probably only ever applied in limited social circles. There is some indication that 18th century tea drinkers sometimes drank from the saucer, for example, perhaps as a means of cooling the liquid, but this was considered decidedly poor form later. Slurping tea was also bad manners, and middle-class children were corrected if they did so. Beyond that, there were many conventions of custom and practice that marked the elite from the rest, often played out at the ritual consumption of tea on social occasions. Whether and when tea should be served to visitors was a case in point. The arcane rules of these encounters were determined by the few to exclude the many, and were generally learned by wealthy young ladies by accompanying their mothers paying afternoon calls. It was at such gatherings and at more organised tea parties that they practised the art of drinking tea from fragile cups, managing cup, saucer and plate with appropriate delicacy, and avoiding any other sins against the complex rules of etiquette prevailing at the time. And you will see that the lady who's drinking her tea in this photograph is wearing elbow-length gloves. By the late 19th century, afternoon tea parties were an established form of elite entertainment, often reported in the local newspapers. A new form of costume appeared for these occasions, the tea gown. Initially, this resembled afternoon dress in its cut and style, but it later appeared more like a less formal dinner gown. For ordinary folk, tea was a much more relaxed affair, often consumed in the kitchen table or in the garden if a family had one. Just when Victorians began to observe the ritual of, quote, afternoon tea is not clear. One article in the Australasian of 1882 described it as quite a modern luxury, but implied that many were by then thoroughly addicted to it. Bill Boyd's memories of Bimburi in the 1920s, and you'll remember that we showed the photograph of the girls taking out the lunch with the billy, suggests that lunch and afternoon tea were sometimes conflated, at least amongst those working on small farms. Not for them, perhaps, the luxury of an additional extended break for tea. Now, I did chance on one interesting little tidbit of information, as happens when you're trawling through Trove, and that concerned the origins of the break for afternoon tea at the cricket. In 1898, The Age published a little snippet reporting on a speech given by the English cricketer Lord Hawke, who had delivered a speech on cricket in which he condemned the Australian practice of allowing an interval in the afternoon's play for tea. Lord Hawke expressed the hope that English cricketers would avoid the adoption of this practice. Well, he was wrong there. Cricket historians may be able to confirm whether this was indeed a peculiarly Australian contribution to the rules of cricket, but it does begin to look as if it was. By the 1890s, local newspapers published regular columns of recipes for cakes and biscuits to serve at afternoon tea. One of Queen Bee's columns in 1897 printed recipes for hot cakes, including scones, dropped scones, soda scones, oat cakes, and tea cakes. By the 1920s, the same newspaper reported a change in afternoon tea tastes. A few years ago, the little savoury was unknown at afternoon tea, but modern taste often prefers it to the sweeper cakes and recipes. The author proceeded to offer some recipes, quote, in answer to special request for savoury puffs and eclairs. In the 1950s, the Australian Women's Weekly was on hand to offer advice and recipes to the post-war woman, with the added bonus of coloured illustrations to show how to arrange the tea table to best effect. With the restrictions of rationing a distant memory, afternoon tea parties could demonstrate a new abundance. Gone were the old slices of bread and butter. Cakes and biscuits, savoury and sweet, graced the beautifully dressed table. Afternoon tea parties had long been regarded as a form of women's entertainment, but the weekly in particular emphasised the feminine nature of afternoon tea, in line with post-war rhetoric. Now, the 1950s and 60s was probably the swan song of afternoon tea. Thereafter, it languished somewhat, probably as more and more women entered the workforce. But baby boomer children often have fond memories of those afternoon teas at family gatherings, tennis afternoons, cricket games, or picnics. We hung around the tea trolley hopefully, waiting to swoop on our favourite morsels once the adults had moved out of the way. Individual cooks are often famous for particular delicacies. I remember hoping that my mother's eldest sister, Dorothy, would bring along her powder puffs, little circles of airy sponge filled with whipped cream. She was still making them in the early 21st century for yet another generation to enjoy. I have a recipe complete with precise instructions on a complicated baking process devised to work in a post-war electric oven. So it was with some surprise and delight that I found a similar recipe in Olalengi & Go's recent sweet collection. This notes that the recipe was contributed by Helen Go after a recent trip to attend a wedding in regional Victoria, suggesting that powder puffs may well have been another Australian contribution to the afternoon tea table. Indeed, I found a recipe for powder puffs amongst prize recipes published by the Australian Women's Weekly in October 1952. Along with the extensive range of teaware called for on smart occasions, an aspiring hostess was also required to dress the tea table appropriately. From the 1930s, the Australian Women's Weekly provided a visual guide in its many illustrations. But long before this, newspapers provided instructions and patterns for competent needlewomen to make the tablecloths, tea cloths, doilies, and napkins considered essential accompaniments to the tea table. Some of these cloths were minor works of art, exhibiting the varied needlework techniques of the skilled needlewoman. Broderie anglaise, drawn thread work, cut work, and various lace insertions all appeared on tablecloths, tea cloths, and tray cloths in the 19th century. Prizes were often awarded for embroidered tablecloths and tea cloths at local fairs and agricultural shows. Now, the intricate border shown on this tablecloth features raised embroidery, broderie anglaise, and drawn thread work. It took 6 years to make. The borders were created by pulling threads from the cloth and filling the spaces with different embroidery and lace-making stitches. From the 1920s, embroidery designs using coloured threads became more popular, and patterns were reproduced in local newspapers and women's magazines. I still have some of these tucked away in my linen cupboard. Somehow I just can't quite bring myself to throw them out. Now, rather less taxing but equally essential were the tea cosies, routinely used on teapots to keep the tea hot. These might be made of embroidered fabric, lined and padded for insulation, but for everyday use were more likely to be knitted or crocheted. Many a child was set the task of knitting a tea cosy as an early knitting project. Families often owned several tea cosies for different sized teapots and for use on different occasions. This particular tea cosy was knitted by prize-winning knitter Vera Neal, famed for knitting with 1 and 2 ply wool, which is very, very fine, and on piano wire or bicycle spokes as needles. She often entered and won garments in local agricultural shows in Victoria and New South Wales. And just in case you thought tea cosies were a thing of the past, check out this marvellous creation, the work of a young craft worker who posts to her Instagram account as @VictoriaMakesThings. Her mum is one of our volunteers, and this was her Christmas present last year. Isn't it fabulous? Now, for decades, tea was central to family entertaining and to family life. The first response to any visitor was often to offer a cup of tea. As either celebration or consolation, a cup of tea was the answer. But cups of tea often punctuated ordinary days too, and we were lucky to be told the story of one family's teapot not long after the Belongings exhibition opened. So let me finish by sharing it with you now. This is the story of a hard-working teapot, a Rober perfect teapot like the example pictured here. The perfect teapot in our story lived for most of its life on a pastoral property in Balranald in New South Wales, near the Victorian border, in a kitchen presided over by Lena Salau. Lena grew up in regional Victoria and married Bill in 1949, a second marriage for both of them. The teapot was a wedding present from Bill's son and daughter-in-law, and Lena treasured it. Silver plate teapots were expensive items, as we've seen, and this teapot presided at every meal. Rober's perfect teapot was a clever concept that dealt with two common problems of tea making: the tendency for tea left brewing for too long to become bitter and stewed, and the annoyance of dealing with tea leaves once the tea was ready. Both problems were eliminated by Rober's design of a small perforated cylinder inside the teapot, which contained the leaves for removal once the tea was ready to serve. This allowed tea to be kept warm in the pot without stewing, while also allowing the tea to be poured without depositing tea leaves in the cup. In a very clever marketing strategy, the company also printed tickets on their packaged tea, which could be used towards the purchase of the teapot. The article shown here explains how the system worked. It was a very clever means of helping to make an article of silver plate that was otherwise quite an expensive purchase appear more affordable, and it apparently worked. The perfect teapot was produced from 1927 until at least 2002, long after the Rober Tea Company itself had been taken over by Tetley. Of course, it was also intended to persuade customers to continue purchasing Rober tea rather than any other brand. Now, there was a routine to life on Lena and Bill's farm that began early, with tea. The kettle sat on the hob near the fire all night, so they could come to the boil quickly when needed in the morning. Both early risers, Lena served Bill his first cup of tea soon after dawn, along with 2 biscuits, generally a milk coffee biscuit and a milk arrowroot. She then set about building the fire in the wood stove to cook breakfast, while Bill began on the first outdoor tasks of the day. An hour or so later, Bill came in for a cooked breakfast. This varied from day to day, but it was often meat, sausages or chops, or bacon and eggs with toast and tea. Both drank their tea with milk and sugar, always from patterned china cups and saucers. Morning tea followed at about 10 o'clock. Biscuits were served once again, but these were home-baked biscuits. Cornflake biscuits, little chocolate biscuits with almonds, rock cakes, or something similar. Lena was a good baker and bought her supplies in bulk because the farm was some 26 miles out of town. Beside the pantry in her kitchen was a cupboard with 2 large bins, one for flour and one for sugar, refilled from supplies bought by the bag. Lunch was served at about 1 o'clock, timed to tune into an episode of Blue Hills on the radio. This was generally a cold meal with cold meat of some sort, salad, bread and butter, and tea. Hot food was possibly served in the winter. Work stopped again mid-afternoon for afternoon tea. This was a repeat of morning tea, but often cake replaced biscuits on the food menu. Selina's recipe book is still preserved in the family and includes recipes for all kinds of cakes and biscuits. On special occasions, there might be a sponge cake. But the family remembers that their special favourite was little cakes called puff-talloons, which were baked on a griddle or frying pan, a bit like scones or damper really, and served with butter or jam and cream. I'd never heard of them before, but the recipe from Lena's daughter's cookbook is very well worn, as you can see, and Lena herself stored that recipe in her head. The final meal of the day was served after outside work ceased for the day and was generally called simply tea. This almost always was a hot meal with a meat course and vegetables from the farm garden, followed by dessert. After the evening meal was cleared away, the teapot came out once again for the last time to serve tea while the family played cards, listened to the radio, or later on watched TV. It sat, kept warm by a knitted tea cosy, until everyone was ready for bed. At that point, it was rinsed and set aside, ready for the morning. And in line with popular tea law, Lena's grandchildren remember that the teapot was never washed inside, just rinsed out with water. Lena believed that the staining on the inside improved the flavour, and that washing would spoil the flavour of the tea. Family members were undecided about whether the silver on the outside of the teapot was cleaned, but they do remember that it was tarnished from use. Now, the schedule of meals remembered by Lena's children and grandchildren seems to have varied very little from day to day. The meals also suggest, incidentally, that the household consumed a large amount of sugar. In addition to the sugar added to tea, there were the biscuits, cakes, bread and jam that accompanied it. We begin to see how Australians became the largest consumers of sugar. At Lena's teapot, it was always known as Granny's teapot by the grandchildren, continued in use many times each day until Lena herself died in 1989. It was held in such affection by the family that Lena promised each of her granddaughters a similar teapot when they married. The oldest grandchild, Julie, received a later version of the Robert teapot when she married in 1983 and used it for many years. For all of the children and grandchildren, the teapot conjured happy memories of regular visits to Granny's farmhouse kitchen, meals around the large kitchen table, and copious cups of tea. It helps to remind us not only that objects often embody stories of past lives, but that their continued use is a tangible link to our own pasts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. That was just lovely. I think we'll all be looking at our teapots slightly differently. While you have a breath, I'll give a shout out for our exhibition. So Belongings, Objects and Family Life is on display for free at the Old Treasury Building. We are open every day except Saturday from 10 till 4. There's also a vast store of knowledge available on our website. And while we're talking object history, you might be interested to join us on Friday, the 7th of June at 1 p.m. for Objects at Sea, where Luke Keogh will examine the Wardian case, which is an airtight glass case which preserves plant specimens for long periods of time. And Dr. Peter Hobens will look at a brandy bottle which survived the 1881 shipwreck of the Queen of Nations. Tickets for Objects at Sea are available on our website or on our Humanitics page. While everyone's typing away, Margie, I wondered if you'd like to comment on some of the other objects in the exhibition and why they were chosen?
Of course. Well, it's interesting. We began by looking at the family home, which probably won't surprise anybody. And we called that a home of our own. And we did that because we thought that families in Australia in particular often to own a home of one's own was seen as being part of the Australian way of life. It was part of what distinguished Australians and Australian families. And that was a reality, actually. More in the from the 20th century than the 19th century, but certainly it became one. But we also looked at all sorts of other things. The inside toilet was another thing we looked at. The motor car, won't surprise anybody. Camera, the telephone and the modern smartphone, the television, but also things like the contraceptive pill and infant feeding bottles. All sorts of things which we argue shape the family. We also have a little section which looks at cultural traditions and the way these are sometimes handed on too. And that includes some recipe books, which is rather fun.
First question is, do you have your own favourite tea and teapot?
Oh, I do. Now, this is going to be a bit embarrassing, actually. But my sister lives in England. And while I was staying with her, I tried Harrods Ceylon afternoon tea. And I acquired a taste for it, which was a very foolish thing to do because it's extremely expensive and you can't buy it easily in Australia. But that is kind of at the top of my preferred afternoon tea. But actually, I suspect any good Ceylon afternoon tea mix would be absolutely fine, and it doesn't have to come from Harrods. A teapot. I have, it's an ordinary little white teapot, ceramic teapot, with a little metal container in the middle to keep the tea leaves out of the way. And that's what I'm using at the moment. But I've had various teapots over time. I do like the ones with the little container in the middle, though, I must say. It makes it much easier.
So you're a leaf tea over a tea bag?
Absolutely, unquestionably. Tea bags if one has absolutely nothing else and you have to.
Fair, totally fair. You mentioned that coffee really overtook tea perhaps in the 1940s?
No, I don't think it overtook tea, but it certainly started to have an impact. And part of the reason for that was the invention of instant coffee. So who made instant coffee now? All sorts of people, didn't they? I forget what one of the first ones was. Coffee in particular became popular during the Second World War when the American servicemen were stationed in Melbourne. And lots of Melbourne hostesses were advised that they must serve the servicemen coffee, not tea. But it was instant coffee that had the impact rather than the brewed version, which of course Italian and other European immigrants had brought with them. That really started to become popular from the 1960s, but really is a much more recent popular cult, isn't it? I mean, all of us now have to have our barista coffee, don't we?
Definitely.
Now, I'm not too sure. Is it probably the last 2 decades that's really been growing, hasn't it? But no, it was instant coffee. And for obvious reason, I mean, you stuck a spoon in a cup, stirred it, and there it was, boom. And it seemed to deliver a bit more caffeine than tea, which it probably did. Instant tea, I don't think ever took on, although it did exist.
Wow.
Yeah, but it was instant coffee. And I think there were women like, say, my mother's generation, who for a long time preferred instant coffee. She didn't like what she called cafe coffee. She said it was bitter. And that was interesting, I think. Yes.
How fascinating. We've reached our time. So thank you, Margaret, and thank you everyone for staying with us to the end. And a quick reminder to come and see the Belongings exhibition at the Old Treasury. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, Katie.